Hello learners, in today's video we are going to see what are the admissible expenses and inadmissible expenses under the head profit or gain from business or profession. So admissible, as the name says, admissible means acceptable or valid. It is a valid expense for which deduction will be allowed. So let us quickly see the meaning now. Admissible expenses means expenses allowed as deduction. It is allowed as deduction under the head profit or gain from business or profession. In any business or profession, if these following expenses are occurring, then they are considered as admissible expenses. So now these are the expenses that are admissible and deduction is allowed under the head profit or gain from business or profession. So the first one is rent, rates, taxes, repairs and insurance for building. So building is a capital asset. Building is a capital asset. Any rent, rates, taxes, repairs and insurance for building. So if these expenses are occurring for any building, then it is allowed as a deduction. Next one, repairs and insurance of machinery, plant and furniture. So if you are making a note of it, kindly you can also highlight the same. Repairs and insurance of machinery, plant and furniture. Again, these three are also capital asset, but only repairs and insurance of machinery, plant and furniture is considered as deduction. Okay, so mark it as important. You will come to know why this is important by the end of this class. Then we have depreciation. Depreciation is also considered as deduction. Then investment allowance. Any investment allowance made by the business or profession in notified backward area in Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Telangana, West Bengal. So these places, which is Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Telangana and West Bengal's notified backward areas, only the notified backward areas. If any investment allowance is made towards the notified backward area, which is in the state of Andhra Pradesh, Bihar, Telangana or West Bengal, only these expenses will be allowed as deduction. Next, tea, coffee, rubber development account. So expenses towards the development of tea, coffee or rubber plantation, then it will be considered as a deduction. Then we have site restoration fund, expenditure on scientific research. Any expenses towards the scientific research is also considered as a deduction. Expenditure for obtaining right to use spectrum for telecommunication services. So to get any spectrum right to use the telecommunication service. So those expenditures are also considered as deduction. Then expenditure for obtaining license to operate telecommunication service, because it is their business. It is the main business. What? Telecommunication is their main business. So any expenses made towards getting license or getting spectrum, then it is considered as a valid expenditure and deduction is allowed for the same. Then we have deduction in respect to expenditure on specified business. So which has to be a capital expenditure? Which has to be a capital expenditure? If it is a capital expenditure, then that expenditure of specified businesses will be considered as deduction. Okay. So next we have payment to association and institutions for carrying out rural development programs. So payment to any institution maybe they are into this rural development programs like educating the people from rural area or giving them guidance. Anything as such is done by any institute. So, and if we are giving some payment to that institution, then that expense or whatever the amount we are providing to that institution, then that payment or that amount is considered as a valid expenditure. It's a deductible expenditure. Then expenditure on agricultural extension project. So if you're planning to do some extension in your agricultural needs and requirements, then the expenses made towards that, like buying a new equipment or taking suggestion from an expert, and you are paying some expenses or you are paying some fees to that expert, then that expenditure is considered as a valid expenditure. Deduction is allowed for the same. Then expenditure on skill development project. Skills are very important. Like in present day scenario, skills are the very important part of any business or profession. So any expenditure towards the skill development project is also considered as deduction. Next we have amortization of preliminary expenses. So what is this amortization? So amortization means it is the reduction in value of any intangible asset. Reduction in the value of any intangible asset is known as amortization. Depreciation is reduction in the value of any tangible asset. That is depreciation. Amortization means reduction in the value of any intangible asset. So reduction in value of preliminary expenses means the expenses which incurred before the formation of the company are called as preliminary expenses. So the amortization of preliminary expenses is considered as a valid expense. Deduction is allowed. Amortization of expenditure in case of amalgamation or demerger. Amalgamation means amalgamating with some other organization or with some other business, and demerger is coming out of it or split. So when we split our business with the one we have already amalgamated earlier, that is called as demerger, merger, demerger. So amortization expenses towards amalgamation or demerger, it is also considered as a valid expenditure. Amortization of expenditure under voluntary retirement scheme. So this is also considered as a deduction. Okay, next we have amortization of expenditure on prospecting. Expenditure on prospecting. What is prospecting? Identifying specific customers. So if you are going to identify specific customers for your products, then that is called as prospecting. For development of certain minerals. So for the development of certain minerals, if any expenses is made and it is amortized, then that is also a deductible expense. Next we have insurance premium, bonus or commission to employees. Any bonus or commission paid to employee is also a valid expense. Interest on borrowed capital. If we are paying any interest on borrowed capital, then it is also allowed as a deduction. Then discount on issue of zero coupon bonds. So the zero coupon bonds are those bonds which will not pay any interest. So example of this zero coupon bonds are treasury bills. Treasury bills are the example of zero coupon bonds, and these bonds will not pay any interest. So even these the discount which is allowed for these is also considered as a deduction. Employer's contribution to National Pension Scheme (NPS). So if employer is making any contribution towards National Pension Scheme, then it is also considered as a valid expenditure. Then contribution towards approved gratuity fund. Approved. So whatever the limit, there is a limit for the gratuity fund. If the contribution is within that approved limit, then it is also a valid expenditure. Employees' contribution to staff welfare scheme. So for the welfare of the staff, any contribution is made for the staff welfare, then that is also considered as a deduction. Allowance in respect of dead or permanently useless animals. Then bad debts. So bad debts are those debts which are receivable but the debtor is not paying it. So those are called as bad debts. Next, provision for bad debts. For bad and doubtful debts relating to rural branches of commercial banks, only the provision for bad and doubtful debts relating to rural branches of commercial banks is only considered as an valid expenditure. It is only the admissible expenditure for which deduction will be allowed from the rural branches of commercial banks. Then transfer to special reserve. Any transfer made to special reserve is also considered as admissible expenditure. Then family planning expenditure, securities transaction tax, commodities transaction tax, expenditure by cooperative society for purchase of sugar cane, for the purchase of sugar cane. Any expenditure made by cooperative societies only towards the purchase of sugar cane only. So whatever the amount we are spending, the cooperative society is spending for the purchase of sugar cane, then it is considered as an admissible expenditure. Then general deductions. So these are the admissible expenditure under the head income from business or profession. So now let us see what is inadmissible. Inadmissible means which cannot be accepted. Cannot be. Expenses which cannot be accepted are called inadmissible expenses. Admissible which can be accepted, isn't it? Inadmissible means which cannot be accepted. So now let us see the meaning. Inadmissible expenses are those expenses which are not allowed as deduction under the head profit or gain from business or profession, which cannot be accepted as an valid expense. It cannot be considered as valid expense. Hence, there is no deduction allowed for the same. So now let us see the expenses which are inadmissible under the head profit or gain from business or profession. So the first one is advertisement expenses incurred by an assessee on advertisement in any magazines, pamphlet published by political party. Magazines or pamphlets published by political party, any advertisement expense which the assessee has incurred, which is towards the advertising his business or his profession in magazines or pamphlets published by political party. It is not an admissible expense, so no deduction will be allowed. Then interest, royalty, fees paid outside India without TDS shall be disallowed if the tax is not deducted at source for any interest, royalty or fees that is paid outside India. Then it is also an inadmissible expense. So deduction will be not allowed. Next, we have any amount of income tax, arrears of income tax or advance income tax paid is disallowed. If you are paying any income tax you have to pay. It's the duty of every citizen in India to pay income tax. So if any amount of income tax is paid or arrears of income tax or advance of income tax paid, all these are not allowed as deduction. All these are taxable income. Next, payment of provident fund paid outside India without a TDS. If you have paid with, if it was with the TDS, then it is allowed. But outside India, you are paying the provident fund outside India and the tax is not deducted at source, then it is also an inadmissible expenditure. Payment to a relative by the way of salary, provident fund or interest. Any payment to the relative by the way of salary, provident fund or interest is not allowed as deduction. It is a taxable expenditure. Any expenditure paid in cash or through bearer check exceeding rupees 20,000 will be disallowed. It is not a admissible expenditure. So any expenditure which is exceeding rupees 20,000, it can be paid through cash or through bearer check. But if it is exceeding 20,000, then it is not allowed. Then capital expenditure. Any capital expenditures are not allowed as deduction. Any capital expenditure is not allowed as deduction. But so if you remember, we have highlighted one point in admissible. See, repairs and insurance of machinery, plant and furniture. This is a admissible expense. Any other expenses other than this repairs and insurance, then it is a inadmissible expense. But if you are paying towards the repairs and insurance, then it is admissible. Then rent, rates and tax repairs paid towards building, it is also a admissible expenditure. Okay, so now let us move on to the next inadmissible expenditure. All types of provisions, reserves and funds. Any provisions made, reserves made or funds, it is also a inadmissible expenses. Deduction will not be allowed. Drawing by the proprietor. He is the owner. He is the owner of the organization, business or profession. If he is drawing any amount of salary, then it is not an admissible expense. So whatever the profit is made by the company, it is also a income for the proprietor. Along with that, if the proprietor is drawing any salary, then it is not an admissible expense. So no deduction will be allowed for this. Personal expenses of proprietor. Any personal expenses, if the proprietor is using some amount for his own purpose or her own purpose, then those expenses are also a inadmissible expenses for which deduction will not be allowed. Next, we have fines and penalties. Any fines and penalties paid, it is not a admissible expense. It is not allowed as deduction. Past losses and provisions for loss. Any loss occurred earlier and if you are making any provisions for the same, then it is not an admissible expense. No deduction will be allowed. Then charity and donation. If you are paying any charity or donation, then from the organization, if you are paying any charity and donation from the organization, then it is not allowed as deduction. For this, deduction will be allowed under the different head, but here it is not allowed as deduction. Then registration expenses of business asset. If there is any expenses towards the registration of your own business asset, then it is also not considered as admissible expense and no deduction is allowed for the same. Then legal expenses related to capital asset. Any legal expenses towards the capital asset is not allowed as deduction. Then life insurance premium on the life of proprietor. It is his personal expense. So no deduction is allowed for the same under the head business or profession. Life insurance premium, any amount of premium paid towards the life insurance of the proprietor himself or herself, then it is not allowed as deduction. Then expenditures on raising capital. So if you are making any expenses to get capital for your business, then that expenses is also not an admissible expense. Expenditure on shifting registered office. If you are changing the place of your registered office, then the expenses whatever is occurred, then the proprietor has to bear the same, for which deduction will not be allowed. Then gifts made on personal consideration. Any gifts provided for personal consideration for his own benefit or for the benefit of the proprietor, then or maybe for the benefit of the business also, but the gifts provided is not considered as an admissible expense. So these are the admissible and inadmissible expenses under the head business or profession.